happening now. Again, it's an interview, and it's an interview between and among philosophers, collaborators, about the phenomenology of dining. So the substance or content of it, and Frank, forgive me this, I'm just going to brag about you for a second. Frank Stitt is one of the United States' most acclaimed chefs. Highlands Bar and Grill opened in the early 80s. I believe it was 81 or 82, if I remember rightly, Frank.
82.
82 has been a beacon for many in the landscape regionally for a long time, came to national renown and prominence, I would say, in the early 2000s. If I could, there was a series of nominations. It was nominated for the best restaurant in the United States for the James Beard Awards, which is kind of the Oscars of the culinary world, for many years before 10 years of nominations before finally winning that award in 2018. Highlands Bar and Grill is one of 4 restaurants, all in Birmingham, Alabama, that Frank and partners in the Stitt restaurant group continue to operate. And again, it's you're known not sort of, I mean, far and wide as the godfather of Southern cuisine. There's been a kind of a thing that's happened in the last 20 or 30 years with Southern American food. And you have been a part of it for a long time. So that's just to sort of beat the drum there, why it's appropriate to have you as an interview subject and a focus of empirical attention. What is then interesting, and the reason why we're framing this interview in the context of this workshop, is that you came to food and cuisine professionally after a period of intense time studying philosophy at UC Berkeley, phenomenology particularly, with Hubert Dreyfus, whose name appeared on a couple of slides earlier, and who is known, I think, to many, if not all, of the folks here in this room. So it's gonna be a series of questions, and I'm gonna start with that one. Frank, you grew up in Alabama. You found yourself in Berkeley in the 70s. What drew you to going to class with Hubert Dreyfus, and what was happening in that intellectual milieu for him and you and the rest of the folks in the room?
Well, yeah, Matt, thanks. It's great to be with you. And this was 1976, 77, when I was at UC Berkeley during my junior and senior year. And so as I was studying, and Bert became kind of very much a favorite professor and mentor, but I had fallen in love with French cooking, French culinary history, and had apprenticed with a Swiss chef and had worked my way through a number of kitchens. And so there was certainly something that at that time I was apprehensive about pursuing what was assumed at that time to be not a very respected profession. And I think that I found in the existentialism and phenomenology of Professor Dreyfus was a pursuit of authenticity was an admirable goal. And so my pursuit and love of the French provincial cooking and European cooking in general was something that I was very attracted to intellectually, aesthetically. And in fact, it was a real pursuit of what is beauty, what is good, what is, and kind of a pursuit of aesthetics. And so that certainly appealed to me then, and it still is very much something that motivates me in my job as a chef and restaurateur And so that's kind of a rambling answer or avoidance of an answer, Matt.
Well, no, I'm gonna ask you to go one step further. The kind of legitimacy or the integrity that philosophically informed pursuit of aesthetic value or beauty in the classroom, giving then, as I say, some sort of legitimacy perhaps to your sense of what it was like to be a cook. What did Dreyfus talk about that inspired you so much that you remember now, that has resonated with you over these years as exemplary of the refinement of that capacity for aesthetic judgment?
Yeah. Well, I think that there was a pursuit of honesty, of integrity, a trying to find out in a multi-faceted world of ideas and different perspectives what we can try to learn from those perspectives and how we can incorporate that knowledge into it's kind of like peeling an onion. And as one begins to pursue cooking, and okay, well, this was, say, Chez Panisse was a very influential restaurant for me. And so what were the books? Who were the people that were inspiring them? And so I think that became a real kind of a intellectual pursuit of, okay, well, it was Elizabeth David who really was very much the part of Chez Panisse's core values. And then that led to Richard Olney, who at that time was the leading food critic and wine critic for Cuisine et Vin de France, which was the top food and wine magazine in Paris. And so here was this expatriate American who was in charge of kind of the setting the scene on what was going on in the best of the world of food and wine in France. And so he became a mentor and would do menus, and we would follow his recipes like they were something out of the Bible. And his writing was so profound that that became a huge inspiration to me and pretty much everybody that was involved at Chez Panisse. The first chef, Jeremiah Tower, was just quite a huge personality in his own philosophical pursuit of beauty through food.
Well, you mentioned Richard Olney. If I remember it rightly, the actual kind of historical timeline after those encounters with Dreyfus and phenomenology at Berkeley, you then went to France, and was it then that you sort of worked closely with Richard Olney?
Right. So I was so taken by his writing, I wrote him a letter. I got Alice Waters to write a letter. And so I decided in my last semester of a senior at Berkeley that I wanted to go to Europe and to try just to meet and to talk to this man who had become such an inspiration to me and to us. And so 1978, I go to London. He's in the middle of doing a 20 plus volume of cookbooks for Time Life, The Good Cook. And so each volume studied or represented one thing, whether it was lamb or poultry or classic desserts or vegetables or seafood. And so he was producing one volume every 9 months. That was the deal with Time Life. And so he and Jeremiah Tower, the first chef, were in the studios of Time Life on Conduit Street, and they were doing these step-by-step productions, photographs, and then of an anthology of books that Richard had found the best recipes for each subject, whether it was lamb, and then they would photograph them. All that to say is that they could use an extra set of hands, and I was able to help them out in the beginning of that year of 78. And as it turned out, he needed an assistant at his home in the south of France, in Soles-Tuque, outside Toulon, in about a month. And so I was able to go to Greece for a month and then come back and to work with Richard as he was working 20 hours a day to try to produce these volumes of cookbooks. And he was an eccentric fellow and refused to learn how to drive. And so, I would help him just in all sorts of ways. But it was just a wonderful kind of an apprentice for me to be able to work with somebody who was such an incredible thinker in the world of food and wine.
Well, I'll keep going in that direction, though, Frank, and just again acknowledge that part of this, I think, story this conversation that we're pursuing is then a question about the way in which certain, let's say, classical ideals of aesthetics and ethics were then part of your education at Berkeley, and then later and subsequently in life, part of your practice in the kitchen and in the restaurant. But just to stick with those multi-volume sort of that publication project and your engagement in it, whether as driver or extra set of hands, just to put it straight, according to Richard Olney, and what you remember of that project, what makes a cook good?
Well, that's complex. I think that there has to be a understanding of ingredients, and I think that has to do with an understanding of farming. And I think that when you realize that it's all about your relations with farmers and purveyors, who the fisherman is, and getting the greatest quality products that are produced from somebody that cares. And so whether that means getting up earlier to be at the market to get the best squash blossoms or little rouge or little red mullets, and then it's treating them with respect and care, having a sense of knowledge about the traditions those ingredients were used. And in this case, and typically the frame of the south of France and in the Provençal traditions of cooking. However, Richard and myself and others are just as interested in other regions, whether it's the cooking of Venice or the cooking of southern around Naples. And so I think that to be intellectually curious, to try to do the research about the origins of a dish, and to also have the pursuit of tracking down the greatest ingredients, because you have just an incredible desire to get the greatest product. But then ultimately it is having the love and care and the respect of those things, of putting it together in a way that you want to share your love of being alive through the purity of flavors, the complexity of flavors, through the beauty of cooking a dish. And it could be as simple as asparagus that's just cooked as the guests are seated at the table, and they are placed on a linen towel, and then everyone makes a vinaigrette with the best olive oil that may happen to be from right down the road, or vinegar that you've made, and shallots that you've macerated in the vinegar and with sea salt. And so the simplicity of a dish, but is prepared with the knowledge and understanding, and prepared with a passion of trying to share something that you really care about.
Frank, I know you were with us at least in part of the last session. What you have just said echoes across the morning sessions as well. It was trusting in life and the kind of in-betweenness, the actual intelligence, the intentionality of plants and animals. And so to think in that sense as of the role of the cook, the good cook being one of love and respect for those ingredients, it resonates with some of the presentations that we've heard earlier today. I want to then, though, get us sort of out of the, well, I want to go further and say we can think about these things. I mean, maybe Roman, using your vectors, we can think about them sort of metaphysically in terms of their goodness, anthropologically in terms of the ways in which you acquire that knowledge and share that knowledge. But I want to go and say, let's think about them sort of as an economic, as a business proposition. You then, after taking these ideas and experiences from Europe, came back to your home state of Alabama in the early 80s and launched a restaurant. Give us a moment or two of your thoughts about what it was like to try to bring that sensibility, that aspiration toward goodness and passion in cooking and dining to a place where, you know, I've spent a lot of time in Alabama. It wasn't like there were a lot of people like you around there at that time. So then you're putting that on the market as a business proposition. You had to get investors. You had to find people who wanted to sit down for hours at a time and not serve themselves from a buffet or whatever. You know, like what was it like to start the business, Highlands Bar and Grill?
Yeah, I mean, we were certainly, I was 27 years old. After France, I'd spent a season in the Caribbean. I thought that might be a good place to live, and then decided that I really did want to bring that love of country French food to Alabama, to the home where I grew up. My dad was a surgeon and his dad was a country doctor. And so that was a little bit of coming home. The prodigal son had been traveling around the world and bringing this back, and to try to have a restaurant that was of highest quality, but without the pretensions and fanciful things that were a lot of people associated with fine dining. And so hence the name Highlands Bar and Grill was a little tongue-in-cheek idea of getting people to comfortable with the idea of coming in and you can get the greatest oysters that are shucked with care and precision and have a beer, or you can have, you know, braised sweetbreads with morels and bourbon. And so it was certainly a play of interpreting my love of French country provincial food with Southern traditions and ingredients. But when I opened, it was just a lot of work. And I mean, this was 82. There was a bit of a recession going on. It was a challenging time. This was a neighborhood that was not a very prosperous neighborhood. And so, but there was some element of truth, of sincerity that I think the community responded to and was immediately receptive and supportive. And so, that was, we pretty much took off like a rocket, and then went on to open Bottega in 88 and Bottega Cafe in 90 and Chez Fonfon in 2000. But I just knew that I wanted to share this love of food and wine and cooking. And another little story was that there was an element time when I was in France and working the wine harvest at a vendange and that there was this incredible, almost just epiphany of being there at sunrise, picking grapes, and realizing that you were part of a transformation of taking an agricultural product, some grapes, turning it into wine and making something that might be able to have an impact on a person's life and give them happiness. And so I think that philosophical element and that wholeness has been a kind of a big principle of our work ethic. And I think that, you know, after 30 years, there were still 5 people that have worked with me since day one, and that we have now just dozens and dozens of people that have been with us for over 10 or 15 or 20 years. And so I think that there was a work culture that was based on respect and curiosity and trying to do the right and the good thing in a big sense.
Well, Frank, I'm gonna pose one more question, and then I'll invite others to jump in with questions of their own. We've got to leave time for our colleagues and friends who also will be presenting in this hour, and it's basically going with the direction that you were just going. You're talking about you know, an approach to to cuisine, to dining. You're talking about a management style, basically, that evolves out of that. You could have a management style which was not coherent with that, but that's part of, I think, what, if I understand it, has happened, is that approach has then translated. There are others who have adopted and learned from and innovated in their own ways on that approach. Where I want to go there is from that, through organization, then into, as it were, the field of what's called Southern foodways, right? This is a movement. You're a big part of the movement. What would be your sense of why and how the Southern food traditions have experienced such a renaissance exactly in these last decades?
There is an organization that I helped start, Southern Foodways Alliance, which is based at the University of, excuse me, Mississippi, and their core effort is to expand and to share all of the different and diverse ways that food connects us in the South. And so I do believe, just like my grandparents' farm, where I grew up watching my granddad milk a Jersey cow and my grandmother churn that into butter, there is in our consciousness a connection to the land and to farming, and to whether it's lady peas and stewed okra and creamed corn and those traditional Southern ingredients. But let's face it, during the 50s and 60s, most of that kind of had been reduced to not particularly great food or cooking. And so I think that I've been a part of a resurgence in those ingredients and cooking them in a way that was not just what had happened when in the industrialization of food and agriculture of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And so I think that right now, as you know, our farm outside town, about 30 minutes, we have 200 laying hens. We are growing lots of our own vegetables. And in fact, some of our staff just out there this morning taking part in picking the blueberries. And I think that when people are a part of a process that involves, farming and farming with care and love for the land and hopefully in a regenerative way, that is shared, that experience is shared throughout the community. And so I think that it's great to be a part of this Southern Foodways movement.
Frank, thank you very much. François-Xavier, the next word is yours. I don't think we have a facilitator or moderator outside of the two of us as presenters. Do we have time for a question or two from the room, or do we kick it over to you for your presentation?
Yes, if there are questions or other comments or reactions, do not hesitate. Yes, I see someone. Pierre and Damien.
Well, thanks a lot, Frank, for this great presentation. And I had the pleasure of visiting one of your restaurants and Alabama too, and could sort of witness the wonderful atmosphere. But I've come again. I'm sort of my fixed idea for this workshop is to connect to what I've read, the study I read by Hunter, and in a sense now too also to the presentation by Romain. But Hunter says that one's interested in organizations are basically using the workshop, the factory, the assembly line, and the bureaucracy. What about the kitchen? I mean, could there be any room at all in an organizational science aiming at this kind of total system, this control of technology and stuff like that, to consider a kitchen that seems to be even possible to survive and even thrive in a modern economy? And how do you look upon that? The kitchen as an organization. You must have lessons to teach to people who are in industry, and do industrial managers come into you and say, how do you run this kind of business? Can we learn?
Well, it's very much an involvement with getting people to really care about the ingredients. I have a little story about when I was sauteing. I was a saute chef. I was on the line, and the man next to me was a grill chef, and he was a young man from North Birmingham, no culinary education, not that much education, but when he would pick up a fillet of grouper that he had filleted and broken the fish down, and he would pat it with just rubbing it and with a little olive oil, and to try to get people to have that kind of care and love with the process is it's very, very subtle. But those kinds of things, I do believe that there is you sense that love and care in the taste of the food, and I'll even be, mystical enough to think that food is probably even is healthier for you, and your body is able to digest in a way when food is prepared with that sense of care. And then eventually, hopefully I'm sharing a sense of knowledge about temperatures and about chemistry. And, when we try to engineer things so that it all comes out, it's very much kind of a stage performance that goes live every day, that it's, so I think it's very hard in my mind to standardize systems. It's so much of in the moment.
And that's at least, it's for sure that is demanded in business school as a kind of counterpower or example of something else, and opening to maybe to philosophy. Thank you very much, Frank.
Damien.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, fascinating interview, Frank. I really enjoyed that. I'm working in a restaurant ethnographically at the moment, started in January 2019 in a starred restaurant in Manchester. It didn't take me long to realize that the most important actors in the restaurant weren't the chefs as so far, but insofar as there was a whole host of human and non-human agents there, which you've touched on a little bit. So it led me back to one of the biggest actors, which is soil and the condition of soil. Now, you've probably, no doubt, taken this journey, as a lot of chefs have, that actually those wine practices and the vendage and the grape was actually and is actually destroying soil in southern France, those big industrial French wine producers. And I wondered if you'd reflected on that in the farming practices that you've adopted that now feeds the restaurant. And when there's another part of the question which kind of relates to Pierre's point about the kitchen, because I also realized that the front of house, the service, was beautiful art at this starred restaurant. The food was art, but there was horror behind the scenes, not a bullying, there is that tradition, I suppose, in kitchens. I'd be interested to know if you'd somehow avoided that kind of bullying ramped up masculine kind of culture that one associates with high cuisine. Behind the artwork is horror, and every chef is traumatized by some history. And you know, this relationship also interests me in restaurants, and I wondered if you'd had some thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, certainly. Well, regarding the regenerative agriculture, I work with Dr. Alan Williams, who is a geneticist and is one of the leading consultants for teaching people around the world regenerative agriculture. And so we do things like no-till drilling, of using cover crops. And so it's all about improving. It's not just sustainable, which is kind of a meaningless phrase, but because the soil has been so degraded that you don't want to sustain something that's not particularly good. And so this is one of the most exciting things in my life and what's going on in agriculture in general. And I know that when you are farming the soil, first and foremost, the quality and the flavor and the nutritional richness of those ingredients are just off the chart on a nutritional as well as on a flavor profile. And so we're trying to do this same thing with our livestock, working with certain farms where it is all about animal husbandry, and there's got to be a great respect there. I do believe that this is one of the things that people in America and in the West and throughout the world should be really ashamed of, is the lack of animal husbandry in the way we treat livestock in the majority situations. And so I try to work with just farms where often I visit and I know their practices. And so this is an ethical situation that really needs to be addressed. Getting to your question about the bullying, sure, I had experienced that. I think with the second chef that I worked with was a Frenchman, and he was a jerk and he wanted to dominate. However, that's not been a very big part of my life. Certainly Chez Panisse, it was a very sympathetic and empathetic space. I would like to think that in our restaurants, our kitchens, there's not this typical rivalry between the front of the house and the back of the house. We don't you've got to have a salutation to your fellow workers. You've got to be respectful and kind. And that very much goes to, say, our front of the house service, where some of our waiters have been with me for almost 40 years. And so that is all about graciousness and hospitality and anticipating, I guess, needs. And so that is a whole world of our restaurant life that is, I think, very special and something I am proud of.
Frank, thank you for that. And with that, we pass the word, François-Xavier, to you for the second half of this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you very much, Frank. And I will share my screen. So I'm very happy to share this research with all of you today and to share it in context. as you will see, for several reasons. It's not really a traditional research because it's based on a book in French. And I try to summarize what I see as a key idea of this book with this idea of management as incompleting event. And it will be an opportunity to discuss a topic which is at the heart of our workshop today, this issue of Americanity versus Europeanity, and maybe to settle some confusion between these two categories, to blur them a little bit. It's quite strange to start with this picture, again in context, because as some of you know, as Matt knows, I was on a sabbatical in 2019 and 2020, and I experienced the pandemic in New York, awful time of this period. And the picture you see is a lived experience. It's the last months we spent in New York before coming back to France with my family. And it's a real picture of, as you can see, a fully deserted Manhattan. As you remember, these days, and it's still the case today, but these days, a lot of people were dying. Many people had left New York. We were in a completely desert brownstone house at that time in Brooklyn. And I'm walking. Walking is a way to manage stress and also a way to push further a curiosity for what I saw as an historical event, experiencing history, historical moment. So I'm walking in Manhattan, and I see what you see. I have this strange vision. We are living in a way the end of the world. Everything is exploding. People are dying. Many people have left, and something kept being told on these big walls. A story is shared, something is revealed, something is unveiled. The rare people I see around me have their smartphone in their fingers, and they keep making slide their fingers on the screen of their smartphone. They keep revealing, unveiling what is in germ of the present, and it's quite strange because at this point of time I have the experience and the confirmation of what I'm sharing in my book, something I decided to call managerial apocalypses. I have them in front of my eyes, and I can experience them in my body. And so this vignette is a good way to introduce this book and to share a little bit more about the genesis of the project. Here I share a couple of notes about what I was preparing for this book. So the idea was to write an history of management, to propose at the same time a philosophy of the history of management. I wanted to experiment, sorry, it's an allergy. I wanted to experiment several narrative processes. I wanted to transform a book into an experience. And to come a little bit closer to the project itself, my intuition was that what we are experiencing with this managerial apocalypse, it's a big encounter between management and digitality. And the intuition I wanted to explore with this book is that this encounter mainly happened in the present of World War II, which is also our present today. not only symbolically, not only as part of an imagination that sadly we found in the kind of responses developed during the COVID crisis or today in the context of the war in Ukraine. This imagination and symbolic space keeps coming back. No, it's much more than this, the intuition I wanted to explore. It's materially, discursively, in many ways, still part of the present we live today, this industrial mobilization. And it's also a great emotion to talk about it today in New York at NYU. The main intuition I had was that exploring the work of a former professor of philosophy of NYU, someone called James Burnham, was a way to come closer to what I wanted to understand and demonstrate with this book and some archives behind this book. So James Burnham published a famous book in 1941. This book was called Managerial Revolution. The subtitle is extremely important. The subtitle is what is happening in the world. Is describing something happening in the present. Is not describing a future. He is doing a very prophetical gesture. As most prophets, what they tell about the future is always in germ and visible and already partly materialized in the present. That's what makes the prophecy so strong. So it's not saying, I am so intelligent that there is no sign of what I'm going to say, but here is what will happen. He says, I'm a scientific and the future I will describe is already in germ in the present. So according to Burnham, capitalism and socialism won't be the big winners of the kind of dialectic he wanted to describe and reconceptualize. A directorial society made of manager was becoming dominant, so beyond capitalist and workers, proletariat, and so on. There was a third social class that was more and more leading the world. And I insist on that. He publishes this book before Pearl Harbor. The United States were not officially at war. The industrial mobilization had already started. And he was convinced that the German would win the war. The Nazi would win the war. So there is a big uncertainty and a very specific atmosphere. And what I found also interesting is that there is a continuous ambiguity in the process of the writing of his book. It's hard to understand if what he says is historical at some moment, the kind of concept he is offering are historical, or if he's not more ontological or metaphysical, trying to understand some political processes that have always been at stake in the world. So what Burnham describes in his book is a process or agencement. It's neither a system or a structure. That it's not really the terminology he's using, system or structure. And he's trying to understand something in many ways in this book or the Machiavellian or other books he published later, far beyond capital. And the ongoing dialectic for him will never result in a synthesis or resolution, a big night. It will last and decenter itself in and by managerial activities. And what I found interesting is that he never really says in his book what will be the modalities of this duration. This managerial process that he describes, that is the new center of the world, is not really described in the book. And in a way, following many other people, that's something I wanted to do with this book based on archives and this intuition about World War II and industrial mobilization. I wanted to understand the new managerial process sketched by Burnham as both finitude, infinity, and incompleteness, continuously unveiled by new provisional completeness. There are necessary futures, always in germ in the present. In this direction, a new management keeps incompleting the world, full of problems solved or in need of being solved, full of provisional and ephemeral solutions, calling for other solutions. I found very interesting, I won't have time to dig into everything in the book, but to discover that he elaborated part of his argument at the same time that planned obsolescence was conceptualized in New York. So that's also one piece I tried to put together with this idea of managerial apocalypse. That's also materially part of the world. The world is planned to be incomplete and to be replaced by something provisionally incomplete. And I will try to give more conceptual details. I won't have time to do more than that, I guess, but about what I mean by that. In the book, and for me, it's not a metaphor, I come back to the famous tale, 1,000 Nights, because I think there is an interesting parallel to draw with this story of Sherazade, always telling an incomplete story, opening the way to the next one, also with some folds and holes, opening the way to the next one, and so on. But with a key difference for what I try to conceptualize with my archives in the book, it is that it's not a story told by someone, it's told by a big assemblage of many things, and the process of unveilement is as much post-human as it is human. So the material, imaginary, and discursive incompleteness and finitude of managerial narrations make more and more than veiling boredom and waiting by discussing necessary futures. It keeps incompleting more and more the world. Through this encounter between management and digitality, the world is full of problems solved or in need of being solved. The world is a narrative and non-narrative process, always in the process of becoming consumed by something else, becoming ephemeral. Think about planned obsolescence. So managerial apocalypses are events continuously incompleting the world, from the writing of code to the rise of program obsolescence. The modernity of managerial apocalypses, because of course it's a very modern process, I would say, that in a way managers are the equipped version of modernity. It's modernity with resources. Settles a present in crisis. So in the book, I try to wrap the analysis with the philosophers and philosophical concepts of the very present I try to understand. So I use mainly philosophers from the 20th centuries and connected to my story. And you probably recognize with this idea of present in crisis, Ricoeur, this idea of uninhabited world, with some aspect of Heidegger that I used. Part of Heidegger's thought about habitation is grounded into what Germany was before and right after World War II, with many cities bombarded and needed to be reconstructed. More largely, there is what I call a loss of depth that I try to also understand with Merleau-Ponty and Deleuze. So there are many 5 philosophers in this story. We are more and more stuck in between utopian future produced by expertise and managerial assemblage on the one hand, and museified past, flatter and flatter on the other hand. Our common experience has no thickness anymore because of this encounter between digitality and management, and the narrative process I named managerial apocalypses. Our presence is not alive anymore. Differences are not productive anymore. So the question of incompletion is also that of what I call in the book the American event, and that I try to understand this idea of American event, the founding of events of the United States, continuously re-expressed through the travel in the United States of 3 people. So that's why I was very interested in the keynote of Romain. So I came back, of course, to the trip in the United States of Tocqueville, but also to the trip in the United States of Max Weber, who was in the United States in 1904. And he did a fascinating trip, extremely documented, with a lot of letters he wrote about his trip. And it's also a way to understand a step in the process. And the third traveler I used to understand and describe this American event was Antoine de Saint-Exupéry in New York, in the United States during World War II. So, and through that, I tried to understand what I first saw as an Americanity of a management expressing and re-expressing founding acts of the United States, of the country of eternal novelty and unbounded possibilities. And this connected, this result in a connection with the managerial apocalypse I mentioned before, redescribed as an interesting chasm between temporal infinitude of the deployment of managerial apocalypses, indissociable of spatial infinity of horizon, landscape, soul, and American speciality and movement at large. What I try to explain through the eyes and experience both of Tocqueville, Max Weber, and Saint-Exupéry, it's a very particular American speciality, what Bruno Latour calls, in some very recent text, an American planet. And I prefer the term American event for some reasons detailed in the book. So it results in American planet, a planet infinitively available, a resource. In the first decades after World War II, it was apparently possible to eventalize this hiatus, but it is becoming more and more problematic. And sorry, so I won't have time to detail this idea of ethic of Odyssey. I just want, with the time I have at the end, to explain how I arrived to this thesis and the way I describe it, how it is grounded into a free set of data and experience that are at the heart of this book. First, to arrive to this conclusion, I use what I call as a first narrative process, the intimate story, la petite histoire in French. And it's the history of a non-encounter, a non-event between Saint-Exupéry, Burnham, and Wiener in New York, in Manhattan, during World War II. And it's very funny because I documented a lot what I'm saying. They lived or have lived almost in the same areas, have had a lot of connection, but they have never met. So I wanted to, as they were part of the present I was exploring, each of them, you guess, is a spokesperson of either digitality or management or a counter-thesis of this encounter, something sensible in between. I wanted to see what would produce what Ricoeur calls non-events, or this idea also present in Whitehead's writing in his book, Modes of Thought, that in event and experience, there is also non-event and non-experience, and that they are part of what we are enriched in, not only with our failure, but also by what does not happen. It is also propositional, and there are a lot of common things. It is so. In the book, to come to this conclusion, I used this historical ethnography of a non-event. So there is a fictional part in the book, but extremely documented. Then there is an analysis of industrial and institutional archives. I mainly analyze several archives of the Brooklyn Navy Yards. And it's amazing the number of things I saw in this archive, in particular in the journal of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And I analyzed extensively 5 years of the Brooklyn Navy Yards to come to this thesis that I describe in the book. I also found a beautiful archive at the Bob's Library. I had several possibilities, but not a lot of time. So I hesitated a lot, but at some point I had a déclic. And I analyzed a journal of retail commerce with all the issues for the period of the industrial mobilization, and even before and a little bit after. And it was also very interesting material to explore further the acceleration and the loss of depth of this period. And it was very funny to go in this direction. I also explored the institutional archives of 3 institutional networks of management: the Academy of Management, whose status has been voted just a couple of days after Pearl Harbor. And I saw amazing connections with the industrial mobilization and World War II. I didn't know our discipline, management and org studies, was connected to the war and the industrial mobilization. And there were very interesting silences in the archives. Can come back to that in our questions, because they were fascinating. The American Management Association, also a very good tracer for the story I wanted to explore, and the Society for the Advancement of Management, which is the result of a merger of the Taylor Society. It's from a fictional point of view, it was a beautiful coincidence. I discovered that the apartment of Saint-Exupéry, so who wrote this section about the businessman, was next to the building where management was institutionally invented in New York, at the New York Athletic Club. It's the first encounter between Taylor and a couple of people. And I discovered that it was an atomic bomb and almost next to the apartment of Saint-Exupéry. So there were a lot of funny coincidences also from a fictional point of view. And the third narrative process I included in the book, but for me, it's part of the story. It's wrapped into the movement of this present of World War II and the industrial mobilization. It's what I called in English the philosophical process, a philosophical conversation from the inside, my workshop of concept, in particular with Merleau-Ponty, Deleuze, Ricoeur, Dewey, Heidegger, and Simondon, and in particular their thought that was connected, wrapped, and in conversation with this period of time and what happened right after that. I won't have to go further because of lack of time here. I just show very quickly to give you some idea, and I love this picture because it clearly shows what happened in the US during this period. You have to imagine a country, and I will stop here. That was the 19th nation in the world for its army before World War II, right after the Netherlands. You have to imagine a country in 1937, at the end of 1937, whose unemployment rate was 90%, whose, as you know, was experiencing still a big institutional, social, political crisis. And right after that, after World War II, it's the first economic power in the world. Half of the richness produces the world is American. The unemployment rate is 1%, and a big geopolitics of management at the center of which we can find the United States is established through that. And what I explain in the book is that in the black box in the middle, what happens? It's strongly, extremely managerial, even politically managerial. And it needs to be analyzed temporally, I think, as the inception of these managerial apocalypses that are much more than speculation. What I describe in this process of unveilment, revelation, it's more than speculation. And capitalism, as we usually conceptualize it, of course, we can see speculation as a kind of revelation and a process of unveilment from this perspective. So I won't have time to say more. I want just to conclude with 2 golden nuggets I found in the archives, and just to make this period alive and to show what was at stake in this process of acceleration. And so many of these people fighting desperately against this process of the acceleration. I want quickly to mention one thing I found in the archive that was heartbreaking sometimes. It's the situation of women and their fight at the Brooklyn Navy Yard during this period. I was amazed to discover that it lasted almost 1 year. So women were massively present at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So 70,000 people work at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and 7,000 of them were women. And they discovered that they were quickly part of this story. But at the beginning, they had no place for themselves, no restrooms, only restrooms for men, no places at all for comfort. I think that myself, I would have survived just 1 day in the situation I saw for them. And here you have an extract of something well known. It's an archive, an oral archive you can find on the web of the testimony about what one of them lived around this story of the restroom, the toilets, the yard, the relationship with men, this acceleration, just walk, be there, forget your body, and so on. And I invite all of you to listen to their testimony to save the world, our democracy, our values, and so on. And that's one piece I found. And their fight, it's also a fight for depth and a fight against acceleration, to make it short. And I invite you also to conclude to look at a beautiful archives from July 1945. So not far from the end of the war, from a yeoman called Kubrick. You can easily find this article. And it's something beautiful that the managers of the yard do to try to resettle some sickness in the temporality of the yard, because they call in this article a yeoman managing munitions and in the context of the war. But this yeoman is a former worker of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And so is in the future of the worker of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, but he's also part of their present because he was like them. And I invite you, I can send you the link because this archive is public, to look at this archive, because all what is done by this yeoman in this article, it's to resettle some sickness in this accelerated presence, unveiling and promising a close victory. And don't worry, we keep accelerating. It's you don't know where you come. The future is uncertain, but we promise this, and so on, and so on, and so on. And you see this, that at this point of time, there is a huge loss of meaning at work. And I saw in the archive that it was better that the war does not last 5 or 5 months more, because people were exhausted and there was a collapse of meaning there. And you see in this article with the yeoman Kubrick that a kind of temporal work is done to resettle sickness. So I will stop here. I won't have time to detail the other part and some surprises that I introduced in this masculine world that I wanted to fissurate, to make explode at some point of the book, also in a fictional way. And yes, I will stop. I will stop at this point. And yes, and I hope that in the middle of next year, the book and all the research which is behind what I'm saying today will be translated into English. Sorry, both for my bad English today, my franglais, and for speaking about a book in French. I hope to be able to share all this very soon in English. Thank you. Yes, sorry, so I don't know if there are questions or reactions.
Oh yeah. Sure. Who's leading? Who's giving the word?
I'll give it to you, Pierre.
Oh really? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I think this is again. I have the feeling that and I'm coming back to you again, Hunter. I mean, I'm sort of over-interpreting your work here, but I have the feeling that the vision, the story told by the high modernity social science about the management and so on, is an extremely poor, narrow, and probably in the future doomed theory. It seems like what you were saying, Hunter, and now I'm really freewheeling completely. What you were saying that today the hope is to make it survive through some kind of sublimity, some kind of aestheticization a la Hollywood, so that kind of stuff that will make it survive. But when you go around in New York almost by yourself, nobody in the street, and you just walk into the archives and you spend a couple of months and look at this with your I don't know, sort of love of detail, love of singularity in a sense, you discover completely different kind of story. So I'm thinking of Pierre Legendre, who wrote this, who made this movie, Dominium Mundi, about the managerial situation. It was a film made by Legendre, the psychoanalyst, and nobody can see it because it's really, really, really black movie. And it's not even a good movie, but it's a movie. It's a way to. But if you make this a script, François-Xavier, and have a kind of documentary, intuitive kind of movie around what you've been telling, it could be a fantastic takeoff for a new way of looking upon the management that is completely different from what the American Management Association, the AIMA group thing, and that kind of stuff. Much more interesting and much more rich, and much more fruitful to. Thank you very much. Okay. jet lag and yeah.
Yes, thank you, Pierre. And I would love to do something like a documentary or something more based or grounded into art or fiction from that. And through that, what I would love to show is that, and it's been a big surprise for me, before World War II, management, scientific management, was more than illegitimate. It was even illegal in many parts of the US. I mean, it was forbidden in the US Navy yards. It was not just illegitimate. And there was a huge, I saw it in several documents. So in some compartment of the US society, it was simply illegal. And in all over the compartment of the US society, it was illegitimate. So you all know Chaplin's movie done in 1936. But it was part of a more general atmosphere. It's scientific management in question. And then comes World War II, and it's much more than a legitimation. It's a deep reconfiguration. Management becomes much more than scientific management. It becomes something focused on 3 dimensions: flow, digitality, and project, which opens the way to innovation. And that's something completely reconfigured by World War II. And you have to imagine something that I was not aware of, is that suddenly you have the huge American economy that you can guess, that suspends all the legal context that have made illegal any collaborations between competitors. All people from the car manufacturing industries collaborate intensively together. Everything is suspended. So you have the biggest playground you can imagine to legitimate, experiment something. And everything is legally possible. They can talk, they can do, because, of course, you have to win the war. So there is the best reason, the most legitimate reason to collaborate horizontally as far as you want.
May I add something? Yeah, I mean, the war economy made possible collaborations. This happened in many economies, but usually the collaboration and the price-controlled war economy, because there was price control in most countries, sort of stopped and meant the debacle of that industry that was price controlled when the markets opened. So that there's something else happening here too. It's not only a kind of big oligopoly or planned economy or something like that. But when you, I mean, it's mind blowing because I Googled, of course, Burnham, and you see he's a Trotskyist. He's been almost a Nazi. He's going over to, what's going on? What a salad? What? Yeah, what a melting pot. It's poetic. It's not. Don't make a narrative out of it, because then you'll be back in some kind of dull. The truth is wilder than the fiction.
Yes, and just to react on that, I had the opportunity to look at a fund of NYU called the Marx Chartman Fund, and in this fund you have all the letters written by James Burnham during this complex period when he left the American Workers' Party. So I wanted to understand why he left, why someone who was a Trotskyist Leninist suddenly becomes a conservative quite quickly. And it was really fascinating. That's what I explained in the first chapter, because I think it's part of American history. To understand that, it's to understand much more than the intellectual trajectory of J.S. Burnham. And again, the issue of dialectic, one of the main claims he has, fatal tension he has with Trotsky in the two letters that I found, is precisely about dialectic. And
Walt Disney is not able to tell this story.
In the letters, he criticizes in the book, but that's what I found fascinating. There is not really a counter-proposition. And when he moved to the Machiavellian, he discussed some more democratic issues. In a way, he's not really moving to something else, but he's going in another direction. And so that, but I was fascinated when I found the letters in the from Marx Chartman to understand how important it was for him to try to understand differently this process of dialectic. And he was blocked, intellectually blocked with the Marxist terminology and some views. And on the other hand, maybe he was not interested to go in other philosophical or political directions. I don't find any other options in the letters. And so that's why defining this process, and I propose to define it as managerial apocalypse, and not necessarily following James Burnham himself, sticking to the terminology of capitalism. He's saying that it's not a question of capitalism, this process, and neither a question of socialism. He says it's a third option, something completely different. He says in the book, in 1941 book, that it's not anymore a question of capitalism, that we have to rethink our categories. So
this is contribution to critical management theory.
In a way, which is quite funny for a very conservative thought, or what is seen now as a very conservative thinker. But I found something very rock and roll and interesting, very critical in this book, the 1941 book. So thank you for your patience. I see maybe a last comment or question from Romain.
I noted some applause from various corners. Pierre, you might want to mute your microphone to diminish the
funny
echo.
noises.
Yes. Wendland, your actual hand has been going up again and again. Now your virtual hand. No, comment or question from you.
No, just a comment on this fascinating, project, because it's not just a historical project, because you're opening up a post-capitalistic vision, and I think this is really incredible. And the interesting point is, or intriguing for me, is your position in this. In between, you have not been inside. You have been on the margin and moving in between what you call American and Europeanness. And I think this movement between the American and the European perspective, this moving inside out and outside in and in between, made it possible that you could do this project. And this is beyond an historical study, also something which perhaps we need more to understand by digging deep to uplift perspectives, which we need to see in our Anthropocene even more, because we are living on the edge of a new Anthropocene, apocalyptic, perspective. And so, and a project like this helps to get out of, this apocalyptic modus which we are in. So many things, and just a comment, and in terms of praise of how valuable this project is, in my view. Thanks.
Thank you for your encouragements and the good vibes, Wendelin. Thank you.
And it looks, Roman, your camera is on and your hand is up. Your comment.
Yes, I just wanted to, you know that the Burnham's book has been translated into French, and it's interesting to know who translated it, by whom, and under which title. So
Raymond Aron, l'ère des organisateurs. Yes.
Exactly. And not only that, so it's Raymond Aron translated the book in 47, I think, in his collection, because it was a Cold War, and it was the use of this argument was, but of course management disappeared, revolution disappeared, and it was l'ère des organisateurs. And given the scandalous type of guy that Burnham was, because he was partially scandalous, of course, he asked Léon Blum to do the foreword to the book. And Léon Blum said, if it was not a friend who has asked me, I thought it would be a joke. But there's another thing which is interesting about Burnham's reception to Europe, that in I think it's roughly 47, the first week of the French Society for Sociology, organized by Gurvitch, who was probably, by the way, Trotskyist, but I'm not sure. But with everybody there, you had Friedman, you had Bettelheim, you had Hippolyte, you had Naville, you had an incredible, a whole week, and Fèvre, Lucien Fèvre, the guy from the Annales, was making the introduction, and so on. And it was all on technology and industrialization, not management. And it was, of course, full of ambivalence, but extremely interesting. So just to say that the reception of Burnham, and of course, the other aspect of the reception of Burnham is Orwell, because Orwell explicitly says that his work is a direct consequence of Burnham, because Burnham says explicitly that thanks to technology, the dictature, the power, all overpower, the overpowerful of government is much more dangerous because of the power of technology. I mean, it's extremely. So you have James Burnham is a very important book all over the place. Thank you.
Thank you, Romain, for that comment, and François-Xavier for your excellent presentation. I've got lots of thoughts that we may have time to share. What we've done, people, is just talk all the way through the break. And so I'm not sure whether a break is even possible, if appropriate at all now. I look to my organizing colleagues to ask, is this the Zoom room where the next thing happens? It's not. So we have to bounce out of this.
Again, it's another link in the program.
Hit the link in the program. People, thank you for this extended and wonderful session. We'll see you.
Can we put that link in the chat?
The next link in the chat for this. Let's see.
Yes, it's possible.
Or a mail.
I think that is the link to the next session. Hunter, thank you for that request. So we will cut and paste that into our browser window and see each other on the other side.
Is it starting straight away, Matt?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.